All right. What's up, everybody? I am here to finish up my review of the Spencer case and JPA discussion on moral realism. So we'll see what they get into here. Lebzer, you were a bit early. Andrew Moy, you get 1,000 land salute. Kedeb Podcast gets 500, and Adi Cherison gets 250. So bam, we got all our people with the land salute already. So let's get into the video. I am picking up where we left off. If you're watching this and you haven't seen the previous ones, maybe you'll be missing some context. But this is a discussion between two moral realists about moral realism. I've been reviewing the discussion, and yeah, so I just wanted to finish this one up so I can move on to some new content. So yeah, all right, let's get going. Here we are, and let's go.
But I don't know what more to say about this. There's not a big literature on this issue.
Okay. Well, maybe I should do what I'm sort of known for doing these days, which is to wheel God in at this point. So, like one thing I was thinking as you were saying this was that God could help with this and the skepticism concern as well, and the debunking stuff, right? So what I'm thinking here is that, well, if you have God in your ontology, then it seems like there's a reasonable expectation that God is not going to make morality like wildly counterintuitive or something, so that morality turns out to mostly be about, I don't know, attending to electrons or something, whereas it seems like there is no such guarantee for the atheist moral realist. So a couple more thoughts, and I'll let you react to like the God stuff generally. So that's one thought about maybe how God could help with that particular issue about potentially just like very, very weird morality. With respect to debunking, it seems like having God in the picture definitely is going to be helpful here, because we can say, well, God is a perfect being, right? Is going to have reasons to bring it about that rational creatures like ourselves, A, would exist in the first place, and B, would actually get to the moral truths, right? So there might be a kind of explanatory payoff that you get there by having God in the picture. Sort of predicts that people would be having conversations like this one if God exists. Seems like that's a good thing for human beings to think about morality. Whereas if you don't have God in the picture, you might think, wow, it's like wildly coincidental that the universe just happened to spit out creatures like us that can morally deliberate and so on. And then finally, with respect to the related skeptical issue, yeah, I mean, God's not going to want us to be in the dark, right? With respect to morality. So yeah, so are there morality related reasons that you think might point in the direction of theism?
Well, I think the argument about the existence of sentient beings who are capable of deliberating, I think it's fair to say that does seem like some evidence of theism. Is it enough to outweigh the problems of like divine hiddenness and the problem of evil? I don't know.
Problem of evil.
What's that?
Yeah, since I take this cultural view, they had briefly mentioned evolutionary debunking arguments. So I'm very much in line with the views of Stephen Stitch and Edward Mashery. They're both philosophers. Mashery is at the University of Pittsburgh in the HPS program, the History and Philosophy of Science, and Stephen Stitch is at Rutgers in the philosophy program there. I don't know, maybe they've moved or something. But Stitch played a pivotal role in providing some of the intellectual foundations and support for the early days of experimental philosophy. And Mashery has very much continued in the strain of doing experimental philosophy. And in particular, he's done a lot of really cool work. He's done stuff on consciousness and everything. He's argued, he had a back and forth with Josh Knobe about whether there is a lot of diversity in philosophical intuitions across cultures or not. And, Knobe arguing, there's a lot of convergence and similarity. And Mashery and his side of things arguing, there's a lot of diversity. And I tend to favor the Mashery side of things, although Knobe is great. So there's this really cool book. It's like a collection of papers called The Atlas of Moral Psychology. And in that, there's a couple short chapters. One is Morality, a Historical Invention by Mashery. And in that article, what he argues is that the very concept or conceiving of things in distinctively moral terms is an artifact, or it's a product of a particular type of enculturation. So, you can operationalize the concept of morality and say morality refers to the normative standards that regulate pro-social behavior within social groups. And then you could say, all human groups have moral systems, in that they have systems of regulating the pro-social behavior of one another through the enforcement of norms. So like, hey, don't steal, don't lie, don't kill, or you'll get punished. You can operationalize morality in those terms, but that's not really what he's talking about. What he's talking about is thinking of things in distinctively moral terms. So if you look at norms, you can divvy up norms into a variety of different categories, often called domains. And you could say that there are practical or prudential norms. There's norms about what would serve your self-interest, something like that. There's epistemic norms. There are norms about, how you should go about forming beliefs, what will constitute knowledge, what you ought to conclude, from inferences, that sort of thing. There's very localized norms. So there's norms about like how to tie a knot well, norms about how to row a boat well, norms about how to play chess well, and so on. So you have a variety of normative domains. And then the question is, what delineates moral norms from non-moral norms? What allows us to say this set of norms are distinctively moral norms rather than some other kind of norm? And, I'll get to Stitch in a minute, but I don't think that the answer to that ends up cashing moral norms out in such a way that they form a natural kind, that they're the sort of thing that we would expect non-human extraterrestrials to have. I don't think it's the sort of thing that could be readily reinvented. I think thinking in moral terms is cultural in the way that something closer to baseball than chemistry. So if we run into aliens, they're probably going to have something like the periodic table, but they might have something like baseball, but it's unlikely they'd have something specifically like baseball, like with the rules of baseball and all that. Certain sorts of things are too historically contingent. And what Mashry argues is that thinking in moral terms and conceiving of things in distinctively moral ways is historically contingent on particular cultural histories. Could have been otherwise. And what Stitch argues, he has an article called The Moral Domain in that same volume. And in that volume, he says, look, philosophers and psychologists have both taken cracks at delineating the moral domain, at saying, here's what distinguishes moral norms from non-moral norms. And it doesn't have to be some sufficient necessary conditions. It could be family resemblance. He doesn't explicitly say this, but as long as you get a close to enough nomological clustering of characteristics that reliably tend to be associated in practice with one set of norms that you might think from the armchair are what we might think on reflection are moral norms, and other norms are not. And, as long as this reliably emerges in different cultures. And what I'm alluding to here is the moral conventional distinction. So Turiel and a variety of other people reported to show, and I think that they've done quite good research on this, but I just think it's culturally pretty parochial. They tried to show that children from a pretty early age reliably distinguish what, you operationalize in advance. These are what we think the moral norms are. These are the social conventions. And you say, okay, well, if children are predisposed to reliably distinguish moral norms from non-moral norms, whether that's a product of evolution, the original researchers didn't claim that it was, whether it's some kind of nativist account you're offering or not. The question is whether children themselves will distinguish what you yourself have considered in advance the moral norms from the non-moral norms in terms of a shared set of characteristics that tend to attribute to them. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. And the idea here is that children would attribute authority independence, a generalizability or universality, and a particular pattern of justification. So basically, children would say, these moral rules cannot be overridden by authorities. They would apply to people outside of my community. And what makes these actions wrong is that they're unfair, or they harm people or violate their rights. So something like that. Initially, they had toyed around with the notion of severity being a characteristic, but that was too inconsistent and it was dropped from later models. So that's the moral conventional distinction. What Stitch argues is, it doesn't emerge in all cultures. So this tendency, which may seem very natural to people to think in distinctively moral terms, may be culturally parochial. So I don't actually think all human societies historically have had a conception of morality or thought in distinctively moral terms. And again, if you just operationalize morality as any set of norms, we're going to call that morality, as long as it regulates, interpersonal behavior within social groups. Sure, then every society has morality. But I'm talking about how one conceives of the norms themselves, what they themselves treat the norms as being. And I don't think that there's anything like that that is universal as a feature of our shared human psychology. I think it's cultural. So given that, it's a little interesting when someone will say something. This is going all the way back. I know I've been talking for a while. JPA will suggest that our tendency to think in moral terms is evidence of God, is evidence of theism. But I think it's the other way around. I think that historically, cultures that have developed theism, especially like the Judeo-Christian and monotheistic traditions that we're familiar with, I think they've led to the development of thinking in distinctively moral terms. So I don't think it's thinking in moral terms as evidence of theism. I think thinking in moral terms is a legacy of being theist, or having being part of a long lineage of people whose cultural backgrounds were theistic. So I think there's something kind of funny here, which is that I do think that this comes down to empirical questions about whether I'm right about that. This would take archaeological, anthropological, sociological, psychological, historical, all sorts of types of evidence to try to support this. And there may not be enough evidence available to establish that I'm right about this. And so it could just remain as a bit of speculative hypothesizing that we might not be able to adequately corroborate. But there does seem to be a presumption among many people that thinking in moral terms is very, very natural to human beings, and it isn't a product of culture. And I think that it is. And so when I hear this sort of thing, I don't really think it's very good evidence of theism. So I don't agree with Spencer about this.
I.e. the problem of evil.
Because I actually think that too.
This is just it's part of the problem of evil, and if there's an explanation of the most horrific forms of suffering, then there's that vindicates God's existence. There will be an explanation of divine hiddenness. But I digress. Sorry.
No. I think that's probably right. I think there's a way of constructing the divine hiddenness problem so it isn't a form of the problem of evil. But it's true that if you had a solution to the one, it should help with the other, like a very great deal. Some of the arguments you're making, though, on God's behalf do have this sort of Deus ex machina flavor to me. They sort of like you're just any kind of problem you have, like have the guy on the stage come down with a rope and make everything fix.
For some reason, it made me immediately think of Vanilla Ice, and it's like, if you got a problem, I'll solve it. And it just made me think someone has to have done like a Christian parody where it's like, if you got a problem, God can solve it, something like that. Someone's got, it's like a Christ baby. That has to be a song. That has to be a Christ baby song. In fact, I'm going to look it up. Someone has to have done Christ baby. I can't play it because I'm sure it'll be copyrighted. Yep. Okay. I must have seen this before. Let me, I'm going to play it myself. But I'm not going to play it because there's probably some kind of copyright on it. But it does exist, and I was right about that. I don't know. It doesn't look familiar, but you know how it is. Like, you see some stupid video, and then it'll just like sit in the back of your mind for a long time. But yeah, Christ baby. It's such an obvious one, but that's so dated that I don't even know if people are going to know like Vanilla Ice lyrics anymore. Stop, collaborate, and listen. I was back. I know the lyrics, at least for the first verse, but whatever. Oh, that's really. Oh, I'm old. That's not good. I'm old. Oh, wow. That makes me. Oh, now I'm depressed. All right, let's keep going with the video. Maybe God can solve the depression. Yes, we need God. JPA, get me God to help with being sad.
I kind of, and then I think this is a not so noble tradition of philosophical argument where making a bunch of skeptical arguments and then God comes and puts Humpty Dumpty back together again or whatever. I'm not into that.
So I disagree with that for this reason. God has been central to philosophical theorizing going back to the ancient world. In fact, lots of the great philosophers would say that philosophy really has to begin with God, actually. God is the fundamental existent And so if it were the case that like dreaming up this entity to come in and solve a philosophical problem, that would be one thing. But if instead I'm talking about, like potentially the ground of all being, whose existence we might think is evidenced by a bunch of different data points that we encounter, right? So like there are a bunch of independent reasons for thinking that God exists. Well, to then note that, oh, hey, like if that being, potentially the fundamental being exists, that would resolve some of these difficulties in meta ethics. That seems totally legitimate to me, and doesn't seem like a Deus ex machina.
Maybe, yeah, maybe if you're already, I
In
mean,
fact,
I've heard it
Aristotle
said,
himself might say something along these lines, because lest we forget, Aristotle was some kind of weird deist.
some kind, yeah. Was interestingly enough, as I think you probably know, the unmoved mover for Aristotle, I just learned this a few years ago. It's a final end, not like an efficient cause, but like a
I'm not interested in this part of it that much, so hopefully they end up talking about something that I have something to comment on. I don't have any problem with philosophy of religion type stuff. It's just not my thing.
final cause. So it
Yeah.
is that toward which everything
all
strives,
is oriented. That's right. Yeah,
which
that's
is
why
which
God.
is a
Yeah, so the prime mover is also the source of teleology in nature.
yeah, it's a radically different notion of what the first mover is than what I had been thinking since I was an undergrad. I
Well,
don't know why that had to wait until I had my PhD for a few
yeah.
years before I
Well,
realized.
lots of philosophy instructors don't really do God justice these days. That's one of my hobby horses, but that's also for another episode where I'll just rant about this.
Not doing God justice. That sounds serious. Yeah.
Yeah, that is serious, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I'm with Spencer here. I'm just not that interested in theistic proposals. I don't find it to be an interesting way of approaching things. I don't think it's particularly likely to be fruitful. I don't have any particular animus towards people taking theistic approaches to things. So if people want to pursue that route and if something comes of it, great. But I tend to see a lot of it as looking very motivated and ad hoc and not very plausible. And I could be wrong about that. From what little I've seen of arguments for the existence of God, they seem to be more diverse in their overall, like relative to arguments for moral realism, which isn't surprising. One topic is like the existence of a being whose existence would have implications for everything, literally everything, and the other is something more narrow in a particular subfield, some area within ethics. So it wouldn't be surprising that there's a diversity of arguments. But generally speaking, what little I know of them, they don't look to me like they're going to be very convincing if I dig a bit further. But they do seem better than arguments for moral realism. It's not just the diversity, it's that arguments for moral realism, I think, maybe it's just because I'm familiar with them, but they're often pitched in this way where it's like, well, you can take the anti-realist approach here. It's consistent, but you gotta bite a lot of bullets. And I just don't see the anti-realist positions as biting bullets. Like, it's just implausible that morality is subjective. Yeah, no, it's not. I don't find it to be. Or this is counterintuitive. Yeah, well, I don't have that intuition. And if I do have intuitions, maybe it's to the contrary. So that's not going to work for me. Whereas I think arguments for the existence of God as bluntly just appeal to, but that's just implausible. Maybe they do at some juncture somewhere in the argument and they all unravel. That's actually what I suspect is the case. But I think that there's more steps there. There's more potential oomph to them than there are for arguments for moral realism. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, go theism. I think there's a great case for it. But I've seen enough from people engaging with philosophy of religion to know that there's a lot to it. I'm not that well informed about it, and I'm not really in that good of a position to judge the quality of the arguments in the way that I'm in a better position to judge the quality of arguments for moral realism. Yeah, Andrew Moy, I agree with that. So Andrew Moy says, it's so Western-centric it hurts. I don't even know much about non-Western thought, but at least I acknowledge it's out there. Right, I don't know that much about it either, but there's this aggressive parochialism and cultural narrow-mindedness to the way that analytic philosophers approach things. I mean, that should be obvious. And the disinterest in psychology, I think helps serve to reinforce that. It's really unfortunate.
We have maybe some disagreements about theistic meta ethics to get to.
Yeah.
But I'll just state in a nutshell what I think about this. I do think there is a kind of theistic meta ethics that is realist, but I wouldn't call it any kind of divine command theory. So,
And
if
what is that? Yeah, if you want to give the
it's
gloss.
the view that God's like nature or being is the ground of all the moral truths. That doesn't seem like it's divine command theory, because the God's subjective preferences aren't determining. It's not God's commands per se; it's its nature that is underlying morality. I think that counts as moral realist. In fact, I could even hear a theist telling me, like, what could possibly be more real as a foundation for morality than the maximally real being, if you have a kind of perfect being theology or something like that. So that seems like it's realism, but I don't think any kind of divine command theory where it's God's commandments that originate morality, I don't think that should count as realist.
Okay, so what about how would you situate this theory?
Yeah, it's just really going to depend on the account in question. This litigating what is or isn't a form of realism is not super interesting. From what I've heard from people that know a lot more about more complicated accounts of divine command theory, they don't look like a type of anti-realism. But then when I actually listen to what some proponents of divine command theory say, they do sound an awful lot like they're probably anti-realists, or it's hard to say. It's like very on the fence, kind of like certain kinds of constructivism. When you squint one way, it looks like an anti-realist. When you squint the other, they look like a realist. I've had someone show me some passages from William Lane Craig where he really sounds like an anti-realist, and then he says he's not. So I don't know. I don't know how important it is for people to litigate that label distinction. If you do have a type of theistic anti-realism that is divine, like let's say it's possible for there to be both anti-realist divine command theory and realist divine command theory. Anti-realist divine command theory, if we were to say that there is such a thing, is still very much unlike relativism in the conventional sense. So, relativism, the practical implications of divine command theory is like there's a being and they're going to enforce these rules, and there's only one set of rules that carry these implications, and blah blah blah. So when people are worried that that relativism kind of strips life of purpose and meaning, I'm not so sure you have all of the same implications from divine command theory. Maybe you have a lot of them. There's at least one where if okay, so in the case of realism, and this is why I actually kind of like divine command theory, whether it's anti-realist or not, relative to your conventional secular non-naturalist realism. And this is something Spencer brought up in one of the earlier portions of this video. Distinct independent moral facts, if you're a secular moral realist, could just be weird, and they could be something I have no interest in doing. And I think there's a legitimate question, which is, why should I be motivated to comply with them if I don't care what they are? Whereas for divine command theory, if God's going to kick your ass or reward you based on your behavior, well, now there's incentives. And that's very different from non-naturalist realism. It's also very different from relativism, because the incentives aren't sort of a self-imposed. I do think it's different functionally in ways where even if someone said it's a type of anti-realism, I think it's sufficiently different from relativism that they don't have to worry about some of the concerns that people tend to express towards relativism. Although I think that those are hyped up, and that there's far fewer concerns with relativism than people suppose. Oh, right. Andrew Moy says, I don't think JPA's response really addresses Spencer's concern. Just because you say God is metaphysically fundamental doesn't make it any less ad hoc as an explanation. All right. Yeah, so this is a point I've made, because JPA will say one of the reasons we could just presume that most people are moral realists is because most people are theists. I don't think that follows. And people will say pretty silly things. Like they'll say stuff like, well, the religious doctrine commits you to realism. I don't know if JPA said that, but okay, well, Catholicism commits one to being anti-abortion or having a certain position on the moral status of abortion. Does that mean practicing Catholics agree with that? No. Survey data shows that this is not true. Just because something is part of a doctrine doesn't mean that people hold the view in question that are practicing members of the religion. So it's still an empirical question. If you think people are moral realists, you have to show that they're moral realists. You can't say, well, the religion says, if we quizzed Christians on the Eucharist or transubstantiation or the Trinity or what happens when you die, do you go right to heaven right away? I don't think that they're going to have great answers to that question a lot of the time. So Christians don't know their own doctrine a lot of the time. And when you're in online debate circles with theists, these are people that are self-selected and are, you could say, elite thinkers that have thought about these things a lot. But most people that are like, I'm a Christian, they haven't thought about that stuff. And the same probably applies to most other religions. There might be religions where they're relatively insular or they push knowledge of the religion more, and so people know it. But a lot of Christians just don't know the doctrine of the nominal denomination that they belong to, or at least certain features of it. All right. Yeah. So I don't think JPA has given as good reason as I think most people are more real. So he's not saying that in the video yet, or if at all. So we'll see where they take this. I think they mentioned experimental philosophy at some point, so I'll have something to say about that. But I'm not seeing much more to review here.
It seems plausible to me. I don't endorse it, but the view would be, you have to start, I think, with a decent model of God if you're going to potentially have a plausible version of divine command theory. And so that version would hold that God is perfect in all respects and necessary. Right? If you think that God is contingent, then so could have been otherwise, might have failed to exist in some sense. That's not going to work. But if God's necessary, had to exist and had to exist with the particular nature that God has, then you can say that things are good to the extent that they are in accordance with God's nature. They approximate God's nature, right? And that actions are permissible or impermissible or obligatory to the extent that they correspond or don't to the commands or the dictates of this perfect being. So that does not seem like a terrible or obviously false view to me. It definitely seems like a form of realism, but yeah, how do you react to that?
Well, okay, so by perfect, do you mean morally perfect?
I think that, yeah, omni-perfection would entail moral perfection. I don't know what it would, yeah.
Right, okay. So that does seem to be saying that you have some standard of perfection in mind and God meets that standard. But then it's no longer theistic metaphysics.
Well, the standard would just be internal to God's nature because God's necessary, remember, on this view of things. So there won't be like worlds where there are facts of morality but not God or something. And then God's going to have a metaphysical primacy. So there will not be reasons, that are more fundamental than God.
Yeah, that doesn't strike you as viciously circular, because it just seems like what you're saying is God meets God's own standard. I don't see how you get the kind of robust divine attributes you want out of that kind of view.
I think the way I've come to think of it is that this basically just is the view. Goodness requires a ground, and it turns out that ground just is a person. So goodness turns out to be a person. But so Plato had the form of the good. It seems to me that it's open to a classical theist to say, well, God just is the form of the good. Good is God, and vice versa.
I suppose one issue you're going to have with that, which I think you'll be okay with this, but I dislike the idea of analogical predication. Like I feel like if we're talking about, God is good and Socrates is good, let's say. I have strongly the intuition that those terms have to be univocal. They have to mean the same thing applied to Socrates as applied to God. But a consequence of this view is that to say God is good means something different than to say Socrates is good. Like is good is a different kind of relation.
Hmm.
And Socrates is not goodness, but he meets the standard of goodness or something like that. Whereas
Yeah.
I feel like no. Like when I hear God is good, in order for God to be worship worthy, he has to be good in the sense that we ordinarily mean it.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
what I think.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, so yeah, what I would certainly acknowledge is that
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get where Spencer's coming from, and I would lean in the direction of having those kinds of concerns. I don't know if, in the hallowed halls of philosophy of religion, they have rejoinders to that can address that sort of concern. I don't know.
you've got to take on some pretty substantive metaphysical commitments in order to vindicate divine command theory. So I mean, I might be willing to take those on, but yeah, it would certainly take some work, and probably what would at least register as bullets for some people would have to be bitten in the process. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm becoming mindful of your time, so we'll wind things down here. Just yeah. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Could I take a break? Can I take a break for a second?
Oh yeah, sure. Hang on. I will. Let's see. Try to pause this. Right.
I'll be right back.
Okay. I'm pausing. Recording. All right. Recording in progress. We're back. Okay. So Spencer, you have a point about how it is that classification is done in this domain that you wanted to touch upon. So what are your thoughts there that you wanted to share?
So I think there's something weird about there's the semantic criterion and the metaphysical criterion in the first two planks as separate things. So the first question is cognitivism or non-cognitivism. Are moral claims truth apt or not? And then you say, if you say yes to that one, you go on to the next one, and you'll say, okay, are any of them true or not? And if you say no, then you're an error theorist or nihilist. Okay. The problem, or one thing that's bothered me about this for a long time anyway, is it just seems to me that if you say no, moral statements are meaningless, you're a nihilist or an error theorist. And we can see this, like if you consider what a positivist would say, like a very crude, like A.J. Ayer kind of positivist, who says the statement "God exists" is meaningless. Well, you're an atheist then.
One of the most insane things that's ever been said in the history of philosophy. But yeah, sorry.
But yeah, like there's.
Yeah, I've become increasingly convinced that that's not as insane as people think. That Ayer had a specific conception of meaninglessness in mind, and that he's historically just been caricatured, and people aren't really understanding what he's saying. It might still be wrong. I'm not a positivist, but I think that if you unpack what he's saying, it starts to look a little more specific. What he's saying, again, might still be wrong. It might even still be insane, but I think it's at least buffered against the initial reaction some people might have to it. Yeah, somebody here says meaningless has different meanings to different people, right? And Ayer cashes out what he means by meaning in the relevant contexts. I should really just have a positivist come onto the channel. I've heard people say that it's dead and there are none, but there's a couple of them. I'd like to have somebody on the channel to talk about the view and, steel man it a bit against a lot of the hostility it receives. There's like 3 of them, but still, I think it's an interesting perspective worth reconsidering.
It's not a truth or that. To say that God exists is a meaningless proposition.
Mm-hmm.
And does God exist does not admit to a true or false answer. I disagree strongly with both of those things, but I think obviously, if you say that the statement God exists is meaningless, you're an atheist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
isn't that
right.
obvious?
Right. Yes, that is indeed obvious. Yes.
So it just seems like if you say something similar in meta ethics, you're a nihilist. Yeah. And then maybe you're a nihilist who goes on to give us a bunch
Well, just be clear about what you mean by nihilist. If by nihilist you're someone that thinks that there are no moral facts of any kind, then like traditional non-cognitivism and error theory are going to be nihilists. And then, relativists are not going to be, constructivists aren't going to be, quasi-realists are going to be weird, probably not, sort of, kind of. So yeah, this is just a question of how you're using the terms, and I don't know how interesting this is.
philosophy of language, bells and whistles, but I don't care about any of that. You've answered the question I needed to know. You're a nihilist. And the idea that expressivism is some separate track that is interestingly different. It is error theory plus metalinguistic bullshit. That's all. So that might sound very harsh, but I don't see any way around it.
I'm not really sure. Like, is there a substantive point here? I mean, if the idea is expressivists also deny that there are, at least, so you're going to get some weird contemporary expressivist views that butt up against realism in such a way where it's hard to distinguish them. So you're going to get these views of deflationary views of truth, and we got to earn the right to say that moral claims are true or false, and that sort of thing. So a lot of the contemporary expressivist accounts are what they try to do is be conciliatory. They try to accommodate some of the features of what they agree with moral realists are features of ordinary moral thought and practice, and they look very realist-like to the point where they blur the boundary between the two. So if we set aside those and we just say straight up just classical emotivism or prescriptivism, where moral claims have no propositional content, they only express feelings or commands of some kind. If by nihilism you mean the position holds the view that there are no stance-independent moral facts, or the position holds the view that there are no moral facts, then this would be true of expressivism. The type of expressivism, like you could say old school or traditional non-cognitivism or something. And error theory, yeah. So they both fall into the camp that denies certain kind of moral facts. Yeah. Now, if you want to say that there's not anything interestingly different between the semantic theses because they share a similar metaphysical thesis, that might be true. I don't. Yeah, I don't know. Does anybody disagree with that? I mean, people could differ in how interesting they find the difference. If it turned out that people do speak or think or are committed to realism in the way that they talk. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having trouble communicating this. So if you're an error theorist, you think people are like the people out there, the masses are committed to realism. They're just wrong about it. If we found out that they're not committed to realism, that in fact, they're not even in the business of speaking or thinking like realists, that should maybe give JPA and Spencer more pause than if error theory was true. Because the error theorist just says, look, yeah, we're all in the same boat, typically speaking. When we start the inquiry, we think realism is true. It just turns out on metaphysical grounds it's not, because naturalism is true and people are non-naturalists or something like that. Whereas the expressivists is saying, no, when we understand what we're actually up to, people are radically mistaken about what they're up to. And this would then have some implications for philosophers. So if philosophers took themselves to be making propositional claims, but it turns out that's not really what ordinary people are typically doing, maybe that should give them more pause. Maybe that should matter in a way that could be a potential interest. I don't know. I don't think there's a big point being made here. I'm not disagreeing with the point. I'm just not sure it's a big point. And if maybe Spencer's looking at literatures where these are treated as like very different positions in some substantive way, when really the difference is kind of it's a difference that doesn't really practically matter very much.
Now, there is a guy named Peter Vranas who has popularized.
Yeah, so I do agree with this. Uncle Brussels says, LOL, he's just using it as a boogeyman term. I do agree. So it's just nihilism. So it's nihilism sounds really bad. Like I think of what's the movie? How do I not? What's the movie with the people saying that they're nihilists? The Big Lebowski. It's supposed to be this, you don't want to be a nihilist. And so if you get to say, they're nihilists, that puts some stank on the view. So, I mean, is that what he's doing? I don't know. Spencer, tell me in the comments if yeah, I don't know. Whatever.
Not popularized, but he's got a paper arguing that expressivist realism is a possible view to have.
Oh God, expressivist realism. Philosophers and the attempt to just shove seemingly disparate views together. I mean, why not theistic atheism? I mean, what the fuck is wrong with them? Oh,
I haven't read
I
the
mean, I've heard this
paper,
before,
but it does seem to me that like maybe it's a logically possible view to have, but if there are moral facts and you can say there are moral facts and there you're saying something truth apt,
Yeah.
then why would you not say that about like ordinary moral language? Why would
Yeah.
you say ordinary moral language is just like expressive and doesn't posit any moral properties? But
well, you could think that ordinary moral language commits people to non-cognitivism in the traditional sense of like emotivism, right? So ordinary moral discourse is just used to express emotions. That's the central primary function of it. But that it turns out that there are stance independent moral facts. So you could be a realist and a like a descriptive emotivist. That seems possible.
oh, this one abstruse, metaphysician says there are moral facts that has truth value. It just seems totally unmotivated. So it's a possible
Yeah, it might not be well motivated, but it could be true.
view, but not one that has any kind of appeal. And in fact, the people who were defending expressivism originally, the original non-cognitivists, is pretty clear that they were error theorists who were uncomfortable socially giving up on moral language, and so needed to come up with some excuse to keep talking, to keep giving lip service to the progressive causes that they supported, despite being error theorists. And so they concocted this really complicated linguistic stuff that we can and should wholly ignore as
This is a pretty uncharitable psychoanalysis of the motives. Like, oh, they invented the theories because they were uncomfortable with the implications. We could psychoanalyze Spencer and say that he's a realist because he's uncomfortable with the unpalatable implications of the obvious fact that there really isn't a very good case for realism. And I don't think he would take that very seriously, and I don't think he should. He's not in a position to know what these people's motives are, and one could always craft a rather unflattering narrative of the motivations of people for devising the particular metaethical position that they have. I have a simpler explanation. Early non-cognitivists were just wrong. Like, I think they sincerely thought what they thought was true, and they were probably not entirely correct.
total garbage.
Right.
So that is my maybe not so charitable, but still accurate take on expressivism.
Yeah.
Not very charitable. I don't think it's accurate either. And you should hear that part that he said about is pretty critical.
Ignore as total garbage.
Right.
So that's my error theorists. And so they concocted this really complicated linguistic stuff that we can and should wholly ignore as total garbage.
Right.
So that is my maybe
total garbage. You don't think anything interesting came out of those discussions? I do.
Not so charitable, but still accurate take on expressivism.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Yeah, I find that convincing. Okay, all right. Wrapping things up here. So let's see. I was going to ask you if there are findings from experimental philosophy. So for the audience who may not be familiar, one project that's kind of taken off in relatively recent history in philosophy is philosophers kind of like reinventing ordinary language philosophy by going out in the world. At least in part, this is what they're doing: going out in the world and kind of like trying to, in an empirically rigorous way, figure out what the folk think about a bunch of stuff, and more broadly than that, just apply scientific methods to try and acquire data that might or might not bear upon important philosophical questions. So that's the background. Is there anything you've encountered in the XFI, as it's called, literature that you think bears upon moral realism?
Okay, so JP Andrew thinks that this is a good question to ask Spencer Case, and I agree. It's a great question. Here's what I find really puzzling. So I am almost certainly by far the most vocal person that is involved in experimental metaethics research online that there is. If you know of anyone else, please let me know who these people are. Like, I blog about this stuff. I don't know of any other people that blog about this stuff, at least not with the amount that I like. This is what I do. So I wrote my dissertation on this. I'm a specialist specifically in the empirical study of whether or not non-philosophers are moral realists or have realist intuitions or realist commitments and so on and so forth. There are other people that have done extensive research on this, but I'm one of them. And a lot of those people are off doing research. This is, they're not on YouTube doing interviews and discussions and debates. They're not on Substack. I am. And I have, JPA has said things like most people are moral realists. People have mentioned that there's empirical research suggesting otherwise. He kind of made like a Morian response to it where we would have to go back and look at what he said. I've responded to it on my blog, those sorts of claims on my blog several times. I've invited him to have debates and discussions about this. I've blogged about his specific tweets about this sort of thing. I've provided a bibliography of research on the topic. And, I did see that one time somebody linked one of these articles to him, and he just responded with a single word. He just said, weird. What the hell does that mean? Why is it weird? Well, this is a worthwhile question to ask Spencer, who is not an experimental philosopher and hasn't done this research and may or may not have read much about it. Whereas I'm not just someone that has done the research. I'm not just someone that's read the research. I'm someone who, this is my bread and butter. This is what I do all the time. And yet he has been incredibly dismissive and has shown no interest in talking to me about the topic. Why? What did I do wrong? How did I offend him where he wouldn't want to talk to me about this topic? If he's interested, if there's research on this, JP Andrew, reach out. I'd be happy to talk to you. I'm not going to be a huge jerk and yell at you. Even though I think JP Andrew has been pretty dismissive and rather rude towards me. Whatever. I don't care that much. I'd be happy to talk about this stuff. So I find this very puzzling that he asked this question here. Now, I am a bit bothered by this. On the other hand, maybe, this is a case where he's reconsidering or changing his mind or wants to hear it from somebody who he would consider more of an ally. Maybe he looks at me and he thinks, this guy is just this sort of angry contrarian who has a very different worldview, and I'm not considered a trustworthy source. And Spencer is someone that he could trust more. In that case, I think that's mistaken, but fair enough. I hope this question is revealing potentially a change of mind about the potential value of this research, or some curiosity or interest on his part in this research. Now, if I recall, Spencer, I think, is basically just going to say he doesn't really know that much about it. But I do. So I'm around if either of you want to talk to me about this research. I've also been on Majesty of Reason, where I've talked about my own specific research projects on this. But you could also read my work on this. So I have an extensive review and a critical review of the empirical literature on this topic. So I've got a lot to say about it. I could talk about this stuff all day. So I still find that so strange. So Uncle Brussels says, we don't always need to conduct a test. I agree. So we don't need to conduct a test to find out that most people, don't want to be set on fire. We don't need to conduct a test to find out that it's not safe to be launched from a catapult. There's lots of things we don't need to conduct a whole lot of tests to find out that most cats are not glowing neon purple. In this case, though, look at the claim. We don't always need to conduct a test. Agreed. We can observe, for example, that most theists are probably realists, and most Americans, at least, are theists. No, I don't think we can observe that most theists are realists. I don't think that that's true. I mean, when you say you observe it, what do you mean? You're observing the realism? What exactly are you observing? Yeah, I don't agree with you. I don't think we have good evidence that we do have good evidence that most Americans are theists, because we have survey data on that. We do not have good evidence that most Americans are moral realists. We just don't have good evidence of that. And if you think you're observing that, put it to the test, because I don't think that is something that you could just observe. And, there is empirical research on this, and it does not suggest that most Americans are moral realists. If anything, I think it suggests the contrary. Although, really, I don't think that they're realists or anti-realists. So if someone thinks that most Americans are moral realists, present the evidence for that. I don't think there's good evidence for that. And it's not just that I don't think there's good evidence for that. I think that we have good evidence that that's not the case. So we have a variety of studies. Look, okay, I'll do the thing. So the earliest research on this goes back a few decades, but really the ball didn't get rolling until a few papers. 2003, 2004, you had Nichols and Folds-Bennett and Nichols in the paper After Objectivity. Nichols and Folds-Bennett is a developmental study that looks at, it has a novel paradigm. I don't think anyone's replicated it or redone it yet. Tries to look at realism in children, and then After Objectivity looks at realism among college students. You kind of get interesting mixed results for college students, but there are methodological issues with both of those studies. This is early studies, so that's going to happen. The paper that really got the ball rolling, though, is 2008's paper, but from Goodwin and Darley on the psychology of metaethics. I think it's called The Psychology of Metaethics Exploring Objectivism, something like that. And that paper set up the disagreement paradigm and also has this kind of this true-false task that really would be a better measure of cognitivism than realism. And they do some interesting things in the paper. It also has significant methodological shortcomings. I'm not the first or only person to point these out. James Beebe, Jennifer Wright, Thomas Polsler, Taylor Davis, Ross Colebrook, a variety of other people have pointed out that the way we interpret the findings may not be as straightforward, like Colebrook's paper on whether the folk are irrational, metaethically irrational. But a lot of the other ones did empirical studies directly assessing shortcomings with the early research. As our methods have improved, the studies have increasingly shown either mixed results or some of the most prominent papers that I think are better designed than earlier studies are ones by Thomas Polsler and Jennifer Wright. So they have a paper called Anti-Realist Pluralism. I mention on the channel all the time. But there's also the Taylor Davis paper. Polsler also has some unpublished research with his collaborators from Japan that likewise shows very high anti-realist rates. So basically, as methods improve, anti-realist rates seem to go up. So there's also that paper Folk Moral Relativism from Sarkisian, Nobe, and I think there's another person on that paper. So you get really mixed results. You often get very high rates of anti-realism. What we do not have is good empirical evidence that most people are realists. Okay.
The case for or against.
I mean, not really. I do know, like Don Loeb has tried to push this. Like, well, if it doesn't even seem like moral realism is true to most people, then that seriously undercuts it. But I haven't looked into this deeply, but I assume if they're just asking people for their intuitions, like people who are not philosophers.
So yeah, he's right about Don Loeb. Don Loeb in his paper, I think it's called it's Moral Incoherentism, How to Pull a Metaphysical Rabbit Out of a Semantic Hat, unless I got metaphysics and semantics flipped around there. It's a wonderful paper. He puts forward a unique form of anti-realism called incoherentism. And basically the view would be that people are simultaneously committed to conflicting metaethical positions, and so their position is internally incoherent. It's not the same thing as error theory or non-cognitivism or the other forms of anti-realism. It's its own thing. Like David S. Pumpkins, it's its own thing. So Don Loeb does say something that's often not appreciated is that these questions are empirical questions, and he is very interested in the empirical research. I've spoken to him about it. He's been on my channel before, and I've talked quite a few times. You have another person that has brushed up against and mentioned the empirical data, which is Michael Gill, in a wonderful paper that also had a huge influence on me. It's Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics. So Loeb and Gill had a huge influence on the direction of my own research. They're not experimental philosophers. They do metaethics, but there has been subsequent metaethics, experimental metaethics research. So experimental philosophy of metaethics. And the people that have done a lot of the research in this, Jeff Goodwin, Thomas Polsler, Jennifer Wright, James Beebe, is people that have done one-off papers, but Sean Nichols has done a lot of the work. I've done a couple papers on this, but some people have done quite a bit more than I have. So there's other people. There's this really cool paper testing Enoch's claims. I don't know. There's more papers, but I don't want to start listing off just a bunch of names that have no meaning to you. If someone is interested in the bibliography, ask in the comments and I'll post a link to the bibliography. This is interesting. We got an exchange going here. Hayden Walton says, Uncle Brussels, claiming you are and actually being it are obviously two different things. I think most people these include are actually moral anti-realists. So I don't think they're anti-realists. So I favor a position called, you could call it folk meta-ethical indeterminacy, which is the view that non-philosophers typically don't have determinate meta-ethical positions at all. They're neither realist nor anti-realist. I think some probably are realists, some are probably anti-realists, but generally speaking, people are neither realist nor anti-realists. This could be characterized in a few ways. It's not just that I don't think they believe realism or anti-realism. I don't think that realism or anti-realism does a better job of accounting for the meaning of ordinary moral claims. And so I think it's a matter of both implicit and explicit indeterminacy. Uncle Brussels says, at least with philosophers, in Chalmers' study of what philosophers believe, theists were something like 4 times more likely to be realists. Yeah, they are more likely to be realists in that study, but those are philosophers. So they have presumably determinate positions on realism and anti-realism. What you would have to show is that that carries over into non-philosophers, and that has not been shown. The methodology of the Bourget and Chalmers survey, they just sent out a survey to philosophers. Philosophers are typically not going to struggle too hard to understand what's being asked in those questions. So I take them at their word that most of the theists in that survey are moral realists. But you have another problem, which is that the rate of realism is very high among philosophers generally. So it's not that surprising that it's very high among theists. And yeah, so it's just not that impressive of a result. David Hume, Lance's position is boring and trivial. It's like saying most people aren't fans of Yankees or Red Sox due to disinterest or lack of knowledge. It's exactly like saying that. Yes, that's right. Why is that boring and trivial? If you have a whole discipline that insists all people are either Red Sox or Yankees fans, and it's clearly not true, I think it's worth pointing that out. And so you could say that that's trivial or boring, but I am reacting to a literature where people are making claims that I think are not true. If it turns out that what it is that's not true is the sort of thing where you're like, well, obviously. Okay, well, then why do philosophers have a bunch of positions that are obviously wrong?
I just don't think that's telling you that much, because it could be that the kinds of things that would make you say that people are realists. You have to sort of sit down and talk to them and have to get them to think through things, to recognize the things that would pull them in a realist direction. So if you think that
let's take this back, because I want you to see that he references how he thinks they're measuring this. So take a look at how Spencer's responding.
Then that seriously undercuts it. I do know, like Don Loeb has tried to push this, like, well, if it doesn't even seem like moral realism is true to most people, then that seriously undercuts it. But I haven't looked into this deeply, but I assume if they're just asking people for their intuitions, like people who are not philosophers.
Asking people for their intuitions. It's typically what they're looking at. There are a variety of methods that have been used. The primary method is the disagreement paradigm, and it works something like this. You can ask the person their stance on abortion. So the person, is abortion in the 3rd trimester morally permissible, or is it ever morally permissible? Or you just give them a statement. Abortion in the 3rd trimester is never morally permissible. 1, strongly disagree. 7, strongly agree. Whatever response they give, you then tell them previous participant in the study held a position contrary to yours, or imagine a person holds a position contrary to yours. Do you think that you and that other person can both be correct, or do you think at least one of you has to be incorrect? If you say you could both be correct, you're some type of relativist or anti-realist. If you say at least one of you has to be incorrect, you're judged to be some kind of realist. It's intended to be a somewhat indirect method of soliciting a person's meta-ethical position. You're not just saying, what's your meta-ethical position? There are other methods. There's the Collier-Spoor relativism scale. There's the folk moral objectivism scale that was adapted from the Forsyth ethics position questionnaire by Yilmaz and his collaborators. What else is there? There's the true false task. True false are an opinion thing that Goodwin and Arley used. That's not really a valid method. There's the response dependence method that Nichols and Foltz Bennett used in their 2003 paper. As far as I know, that's never been used in other populations, so I haven't seen that anywhere. I've seen a couple like ad hoc or one-off methods of asking people. There's a method that was used in Fisher et al. From the 2017 paper on cooperation that just asks people if they think there are objectively correct answers to moral questions. It's like you could call it like direct. What else is there? There's I don't know how to say his name. Zylstra does a study where he tests 3 claims from David Enoch. So there's like a spinach joke test. There's a phenomenology test. I can't remember what the third test is. He tested all 3 of those. As far as I know, nobody's replicated that. It came out very recently. Oh, and he also created his own meta-ethics scale as well. So then there's another meta-ethics scale out there. So scales typically are statements, and you express how much you agree or disagree with the statement. Typically on a Likert scale, it's 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, like strongly disagree, strongly agree. So there's a variety of measures out there. Researchers have not been particularly, I think I covered most of them. Researchers haven't been super careful or clear about what it is they're trying to measure, but they do often use the language of intuitions, like they're trying to measure people's meta-ethical intuitions. There is some discussion about whether they're capturing implicit commitments or explicit beliefs, but it's not super well developed or clear what the researchers themselves take themselves to be trying to measure. But Spencer is roughly correct here in his instincts about what researchers are looking at.
I just don't think that.
Oh, before I get to that, Uncle Brussels says, what bearing does a reproducibility crisis in psychology have on this? Probably quite a bit. So there is a paper, I think Kova et al., there's a lot of people on it, that did a kind of replication test of work in experimental philosophy. I think something like 70% of the studies replicated. So it did a lot better than the 2015 paper with the Nozick team, where only about 35% of the articles, it was the first study published in 3 top journals in psychology, only about a third of them replicated. And experimental philosophy did a lot better than that. And I believe they included 1 or 2 meta-ethics studies that replicated. Maybe it was the Sarkisian paper. I'm not 100% sure which ones they replicated. But I believe the meta-ethics papers they had in there did replicate. But there have not been substantial attempts to replicate research in meta-ethics. Now, I should say, a lot of the research in meta-ethics is like conducting surveys. So it's not using, they're not typically experiments. They're like Fisher et al. Is an experiment. Young and Derwin is an experiment. Ryan Holyoke is an experiment. And experiments might be less likely to replicate, especially when they use priming. A lot of priming studies ended up being relatively weak. And all of those studies use some type of method of trying to induce changes in people that either increase or decrease their support for a meta-ethical position or manipulate their support for a meta-ethical position and then look at their behavior. So I haven't seen any of those studies. Nobody's attempted to replicate them. So we have no data on how replicable they are. Maybe they'll replicate, maybe they won't, who knows? I don't know. So you have that. All of those papers, I think, had at least, they had more than 1 study, so that at least 2 studies. So you at least have a little bit of internal replication. So that's something they got going for them. But as far as the surveys and stuff, people have continued to use Goodwin and Darley's measures, Wright et al. It's Wright, Grandjean, and McWhite, their 2013 paper. That paper used the similar methods and found more or less the same results as Goodwin and Darley. Goodwin and Darley did some follow-up research. They found similar results to their early results. So insofar as things have been sort of incidentally replicated within the field, they seem to be replicating, but we don't know anything about how big the file drawer, like how many unpublished studies there are that don't replicate findings. But so is it an issue? Probably, yeah. But I think the issues with meta-ethics research are not reproducibility or replicability. I think they're going to be validity. So you're going to be more concerned with the kinds of issues that like Jessica Flake and some other people have raised about myself, concerns about validity and measurement, I think are bigger problems. It's a good question. So I wanted to pause to address that.
Telling you that much because it could be that the kinds of things that would make you say that people are realists. You have to sort of sit down and talk to them and have to get them to think through things to recognize the things that would pull them in a realist direction. So if you think that I don't know that I would say that I'm committed to there being a common sense commitment to realism, but in as much as there is, it is sort of not on the surface. So if you ask a bunch of people some questions and they don't immediately respond like they're realists, that doesn't refute anything that I thought initially.
I completely agree with Spencer. And this is one of the, you could call it an irony if you want, I don't think that people, I don't think the evidence is showing that people tend to give realist responses on the surface, at least within the populations that have been tested so far. You get really variable rates. Do I think that this is good evidence that they're not realists? No, because I agree with Spencer about this. These are the kinds of positions that people are not really going to be able to give a meaningful response to until, exactly like he said, I thought he put it really well. You got to sit down, have a conversation, lay out the implications, the views. I don't think it's something people like their reactive, immediate responses are going to be all that indicative. And philosophers have been saying this for a while, and I think correctly. It's like, in the Joyce and Finlay exchange, I think it's Joyce, I forget which one of them, but they say something like, the answer to these questions isn't going to turn on what people would say when asked. Other people have made similar remarks about the inadequacy of surveys. And I just agree with philosophers about this. I think experimental philosophy is not giving us a whole lot of purchase on how people think about meta ethics. And I think there's a pretty simple explanation for that. They don't think about meta ethics. I don't think that this has been implicit in the way that people think and speak all along. And I think that this does generalize to other issues in experimental philosophy, which is that experimental philosophers will just take philosophical categories and concepts, they'll operationalize them so they could just be treated as psychological constructs that will map onto and manifest in the way that ordinary people think. Then they'll design forced choice studies that basically force you to pick between one of the two. And then since you have no other choice, they'll say, people endorse compatibilism or incompatibilism about free will. I don't think people endorse either of them. I'm also an indeterminist about that. I don't think people understand the philosophical concepts in play here. And I don't think that they have implicit views about this stuff. I think it's very hard to show that they don't, but I don't think philosophers have shown that they do. So I don't think that they're on firm footing to just assume that they're correct unless I prove they're wrong. I think that we're at the very least on equal footing. They haven't proved they're correct. I haven't proved they're incorrect. So we both got a lot of work to do. But I do think philosophers should stop helping themselves to the presumption that there is some inchoate analog to philosophical categories and distinctions implicit in the ways that ordinary people speak and think. I think that's just presumptuous, and there's not really a lot of evidence to support it.
Yeah, agreed. And
and JPA agrees. So at JPA, we agree on this. Uncle Bill says, "Is there a good list of this research somewhere?" Yeah, I mentioned, just throw a comment in the comment section here, and I just copy and pasted old bibliography that I put together. And I could just put a link to the blog post I have where it has that bibliography. I think it was actually mentioned in response to JPA, because he said something like, a couple studies aren't going to convince me. There's actually like dozens of studies. So I could put a link to it in the comments, or maybe I should just put one in the description or whatever. But if you comment and I see it, I'll reply and then I'll pin it so people could see it, because I like people to see the research.
I know you know this, but I'll throw out there what I think is a relevant data, which is that according to the Phil Papers surveys, most philosophers are moral realists, right? And it seems like philosophers are better at this to assess moral realism. So the fact that most philosophers do tend to be moral realists of some sort or another, maybe is like some kind of relevant evidence, and certainly evidence if we're going to count what non-philosophers think as evidence, then certainly we should be concerned about what it is that philosophers think.
So I have a it's actually my longest blog. It's a 9-part series called the Phil Papers Fallacy, where I talk about some issues with making inferences about what's most likely to be true on the basis of the Phil Paper survey results. And I'll make one quick point about the number of philosophers that are moral realists. So it's 62% according to the 2020 Phil Paper survey. It was like 56.4%, something like that. In the 2009 survey, there's been 2 surveys so far. Looks like maybe they're going to run the survey every 10 years. And I hope they do it like 2020, 2030, 2040. It'd be a lot easier than 2009. I don't like that. 2010, 2020. I think it's nice and neat. You don't want to survey people too much because they get annoyed. They don't want to answer. So 62% of philosophers are moral realists. Now, suppose we discovered that within lay populations that the rate of realism was 95% or 99%. And then we find out that for philosophers, it's 62%. So what's going on there? Well, if we assume that there aren't selection effects, which would be silly, there would be. If we assume that it isn't that people that are anti-realists are more likely to become philosophers, but instead, the population is 95% realist, so the people that become philosophers start out 95% realist. Now we have evidence that by studying philosophy, the rate of support for realism drops from 95% to 62%. It's still a majority, but it dropped a lot from 95% near unanimity to not even quite 2/3. Is that evidence of realism or evidence against realism? You know, like if I don't know, let's take something most people believe in. Most people, I don't want to give examples that's like going to get the channel flag for like promoting pseudoscience or something. But take something, I don't know. Okay, so most people think, this is a silly example, but most people think Pluto is cold. And if you survey people, let's say we found, 99% of people think Pluto is cold, like the planet Pluto, or the dwarf planet, if you want to call it that. And then we survey astronomers, and only 62% of them think it's cold. Now I'm going to go, well, hold up. What's causing a third of them to drop off on the view? That's what I would wonder. And so it's not so clear now that 62% is necessarily evidence for the view. Looking at it in terms of simple majorities isn't the right way to look at it. You want to look at it in terms of causality. Is something about studying philosophy causing philosophers to become moral realists? If the answer is no, then it's not clear why 62% would be good evidence of realism. Yeah, Dave says, David Hume says, how about causation? That's exactly the point.
Totally agree. In fact, I would think that would obviously be worth a lot more, right? Because these people are epistemic peers, or closer to it. The fact that most philosophers accept something doesn't mean that it's right, but it is a reason not to dismiss it as obviously completely stupid. If most people who've thought carefully about this, have a certain opinion, that should at least give you some pause before dismissing it.
Okay, paused. All right, dismissed. All right, let's keep going. No, I'm kidding. I mean, I don't dismiss realism in the sense of not engaging with it, but I do think it's a very implausible position.
Carefully about this, have a certain opinion, that should at least give you some pause before dismissing it.
Whereas there are lots of questions that you can be a professional philosopher and never really think about. Pretty much everybody thinks about ethics at some point, so we might think that the data there is maybe even more relevant than it would be in a lot of other, with respect to a lot of other philosophical questions.
Like 85% are atheists, though, I think, or agnostics.
Yes. I don't remember that it was that high, but in any case, yes. I mean, I was partially anticipating this response. Oh, most philosophers are atheists, but so like part of what I would say there, without getting up on my soapbox, is that most philosophers haven't actually thought all that carefully about the arguments for and against the existence of God. You can easily get a PhD in philosophy, teach philosophy for many years, and kind of be an ignoramus about the best arguments for the existence of God.
So from what I'm seeing, it looks like it's 67%. So it's a lot less than 85%. And is that right? I could have swore it was higher than that. That doesn't seem right. I'm looking main survey results, theism and atheism. Yeah, it's only 67% or so. Yeah, 67%. So it's only 2/3. It's not as high as they thought. But I agree with JPA here. I don't think, I suspect if you looked into the educational history of philosophers that they just really didn't engage that thoroughly with arguments for theism. So I don't think it's quite as diagnostic. On the other hand, how many philosophers have engaged with all the arguments for and against moral realism? So I think we could make the same point.
Such cases.
I anticipate the anti-realist response that maybe they haven't been given the best anti-realist arguments either. I anticipate they would reply in kind. Yeah,
but just my general thought is that most philosophers have kind of thought about meta-ethics in a more careful way than they have really about the existence of God.
Empirical question. If I had to guess, I think he's probably right. I think they probably have thought more about meta-ethics and theism, but who knows?
I don't know about that. But
I would go to the mat on that. But okay. In any case, okay. And then the last question, unless there's anything else that you can think of that we haven't covered, is how long have you been a moral realist? I actually am genuinely curious about this. Like, do you think that you became a moral realist as a result of starting to study philosophy, or were you a moral realist before that? What's the story
before
there?
that? I would say before that. Yeah. Okay. I guess, yeah. So I guess it's true that I would see my work in philosophy as really trying to work out the reasons for a commitment I had all along. I think that's probably fair. I remember this one conversation I had in high school. I was like in a music class, but it was really a bullshit class. Like we were sitting around with guitars and not really practicing. We were just talking. It was like what, like a 1 credit or something class. But like I remember there's a discussion like, okay, if God allowed you to do one wrong thing, what would you do? And I was like, I don't know, I'd kill some dictator. And they would be like, yeah, but that wouldn't be wrong. And I'm like, you're right. And I guess if I could do any wrong thing, I still wouldn't, you know, because I don't want to do anything that's wrong, even if I could get away with it. And so I guess it was at that moment that I decided I was committed to the idea that you should just be inherently committed to doing what's right. And it wasn't contingent on any kind of consequences, not even divine consequences. And so, yeah, I don't know when I became a realist, but certainly by that conversation.
I kind of have the opposite reaction to that, which is ultimately I wouldn't do bad things because I don't want to do them, not because I think they're wrong. Like I just get the opposite lesson out of that.
I already was one.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I will say in my own case, I was a pretty moralistic late adolescent. I would say I had a lot of moral concerns that might have suggested that I was a moral realist, but I did. It would surprise people who know me now or have known me in the recent past. I did have a period as an undergrad where I was a very convinced anti-realist. I think it lasted for about a year, and that was because I decided that I needed to be a naturalist, probably some kind of materialist. And it's interesting for me to now look back and see that I just very straightforwardly thought that entailed moral anti-realism. And so I saw it as a kind of broader commitment to materialism, that I should be an anti-realist in the moral domain. And then I think it was moral realism that caused me to reject materialism. I became convinced that moral realism was true, and that the best kind of moral realism, the most plausible kind, was going to be a non-naturalist form. And so I needed to reject materialism and naturalism. And so yeah, that was my path, like out of the cave, as I conceive of it, at least. All right. Okay. Any closing thoughts or final thoughts here?
Thank you for inviting me, and please check out my own podcast, Microdigression.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Okay, all finished up. We got through the whole video. Took four sessions and like, what is that, 5 or 6 hours? Oh, that's brutal. All right, everybody. I'm gonna wrap it up there. I think I got dinner. I got stuff to do. I got a baby to take care of, hang out with. Yeah. So I will catch you all later, I guess. I don't know. Wait, what was that about? Oh, wow. Okay. All right, everybody. Thanks everybody for being here. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, check out the links in the description. You can see the original video and ways of supporting me and finding out where my blog is and all that sort of stuff. And I will catch y'all later. Take care.